Here, we'll get into the Spanish-American War itself, into the actions of 1898, having already taken a look at the cultural context of America in the last years and even decades of the 19th century. Last time we saw an enormous jump in immigration, along with the optimism and the anxiety that came along with that. We saw the closing of the frontier, and along with that closing came the fixing of the frontiersman, as a mythic, aspirational metonym of sorts for the new American character, which was hardy, self-determined, democratic, and pretty exclusively, according to this mythos, of Northern and Western European descent, and not Catholic. Today we'll look at the explosive influence of an expanded print media, at its explicit efforts in the Spanish-American War era to shape U.S. foreign policy, and at its success in doing that. As a nation, at this point, we'd never fought a war abroad in the sense of off the continent. So newspapers didn't just help to shape the events themselves, they also helped to shape American ideas about the nation's international role. But first, and once more, we'll look at that emblematic frontiers statesman, Theodore Roosevelt. We saw last time that he was a cowboy, conservationist, naturalist, hunter, a reformer of political and corporate corruption, of civil service sinecures, of police corruption. He pressed for the reform of labor laws and tax laws. He was a New York State Assemblyman, a prolific author, wrote 45 books in his lifetime, 16 by the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898, at which point he was 40 years old. And we saw that he was emblematic not only of a set of American mythic ideals, frontiersmanship and hardworking, diligent productivity, he was also emblematic of the genocidal, assimilationist will to power and conquest that was built into these ideals, and that remains a largely unacknowledged part of the American mythos today. We'll get to that a little bit more. He was also a colonel in the Army, National Guard. He was Assistant Secretary to the Navy in 1897, Governor of New York in 1899 to 1900. You might notice that 1898 is missing from the calendar. We will get back to that. He was the Vice President under McKinley until McKinley is shot by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz in 1901. At which point Roosevelt becomes the president, and he is to this day the youngest person ever to become the president at age 42. He serves just shy of 2 full terms, is president until 1909. He's the only president to have received the Medal of Honor, which he was granted posthumously in 2001, just over 100 years after the Battle of Kettle Hill during the Spanish-American War, for actions during which he was given it. He was recommended for it at the time in 1898 by several commanders in the field, and again several times since, but anyway, that's when he got it. He got it in 2001 from Clinton, just days before Clinton left the office. He was the first American president to be given the Nobel Peace Prize for, as it's told, single-handedly ending the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, which was itself an imperial war, on the same sort of international and global imperial momentum that the Spanish-American War was. Negotiations started out on the presidential yacht, the Mayflower, and so the story goes. Roosevelt locked the delegates in the yacht with bad food and no booze, and told them to work it out, finish it. It took a few more days, but they did. That was 1905. And Roosevelt was president, he was president of what had just become a global power, and he makes it a priority to end a war halfway around the world, to have a hand in ending that war. In 1897, 8 years earlier, and as the Assistant Secretary to the Navy, he is not so wary of warfare. The Cuban War for Independence erupted in 1895. It was the third of 3 liberation wars that Cuba fought to get out from under the imperial rule of Spain. And in America, sentiment was building on at least ostensibly humanitarian grounds to help liberate the Cuban people from just the sort of imperial colonial rule that America had itself thrown off during its revolution. So you see that in the cartoons at the bottom. The top is an image graphic representation in oil on canvas. But the bottom two are from, the bottom right says, the Cuba is in the pan of Spanish misrule and it's going to end up in the fire of anarchy. And the caption on the bottom says, the duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. So their sentiment was building in America towards this end. And Roosevelt saw this. He saw the possibility of America entering the war, and he was all for it. He thought America needed a war. He thought that fighting on humanitarian grounds would rekindle in Americans the commitment to liberty, to revolution, to national self-determination. And he also thought that the war would be good for Americans in another way. He thought that it would take their mind off of the material gain and commercial acquisitiveness that had so greatly taken over the public mentality during the industrial era. And he thought it would unite the nation. So he was openly in favor of the fight, a true believer in redemptive violence. And so were the media moguls, those who were called the yellow journalist and who propagated what we might in today's world called fake news. Tabloid news is maybe a little more, neutral and representative. They knew it would sell papers, which is why they were into it. The real standouts in yellow journalism were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They were competitors. So Pulitzer was himself a Hungarian immigrant whose boat fare to America had been paid by Civil War recruiters on the Union side. After the Civil War, he pretty quickly found his way into journalism, and he was good at it. He had a knack for writing stories that people wanted to read. They were sensational. Human interest, gritty. Fit to print, maybe not, but they did sell papers. By 1883, he saved up enough money, a bunch of money, saved up enough money to buy the New York World. Under his leadership, it breaks all circulation records, and this was the era when circulation numbers were printed on the front page above the fold of these newspapers. It was all about circulation. Also, he was a Democratic congressman for New York's 9th District. He left what he's most known for. He left a massive endowment to Columbia University and thereby established the Pulitzer Prize, among the most prestigious awards in American writing. So he goes from broke immigrant to tabloid king to the sort of preeminent authority on the role and responsibility of journalism in the narrative arts. And that latter part, other than just naming an award, which has come to symbolize the best and most responsible journalism writing in a bunch of different arenas, other than that, he said quite a bit about this, right? And this quote that's posted here, very famous, it's put up in journalism schools all over the country. Our republic and its press will rise or fall together. An able, disinterested, public-spirited press with trained intelligence to know the right and courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. It's pretty rich, Could read that a few times through. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future of the Republic will be in the hands of the journalists of future generations. And yeah, it's something to think about in light of our, increasingly commercialized media world. But that's Pulitzer's story. Now, Hearst, he stands in pretty stark contrast to Pulitzer. He's a generation younger. He was born in San Francisco, and he was born rich. His father was a millionaire and a senator. Like Pulitzer, Hearst would become a New York congressman for the 11th District. Unlike Pulitzer, Hearst began his newspaper career not on the sort of hard-scrabble streets looking for a story, but when his father gave him the San Francisco Examiner to run in 1887. He went on to build one of America's largest and most influential media corporations. He's known to history, though, probably most for being an extravagantly, eccentrically, isolationist, very rich man. Some of you, bottom right, some of you may have been taken on a field trip to Hearst Castle at some point in your youth, which is, just absurd. I'm just throw that out there. It's now a park. It's maintained. You can visit. It's a museum. A museum to what exactly? I'm not sure. We should think about that. But people pay to go there. He was also the inspiration for Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. And in fact, his corporation tried really hard to squelch the production of that, to squelch its distribution. They lost, but he was that guy. So rewatch that movie. That would be a fun one. In 1895, the same year that the Cuban War for Independence erupted, Hearst, looking to expand and build a media empire, bought the New York Journal and began a direct and at times pretty bitter rivalry with Pulitzer for circulation, for sales, for clicks and likes. And their recipe is the same one we see today. So they are also not irrelevant. So you read about Hearst and Remington. Remember Remington? He romanticized the West, the frontier, cowboys and Indians, in painting, drawing, and sculpture. Hearst paid for the best talent he could find. That's one of the things he did. He paid more than anyone else. And as an illustrator who could romanticize hard and horrific realities, Remington was it. He was the best. So the war in Cuba was good for newspaper sales. America was interested. It was where the action was happening. So of course Hearst sends Remington, who was at the time, again, the best of the best in terms of illustrator. Go get me some good, lurid war pictures, go get me that. And Remington goes, he gets bored, he says he wants to come home, that there's not going to be a war. And Hearst, the newspaper man, media mogul, stiff competitor, politically interested, maybe with a little bit of, hubris when it comes to his own sense of power. Hearst says famously, as you read, you give me the pictures, I'll give you the war. And on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine battleship exploded in Havana Harbor, and Remington's famous image of that is on the right. There was some initial confusion about the cause of the explosion. Did the ship hit a Spanish mine? Was it an accident on board? It took 2 months for the U.S. to declare war because Congress, the White House, and Naval Command, they couldn't agree on this. They didn't know. They couldn't decide. They just didn't know. Pulitzer and Hearst, however, had no such qualms about the truth. War was good business for newspapers, and they made it their business to outdo one another in stoking it. You saw in our article that Spain's secret infernal machine, which you see the headline of here, you saw it compared to the Bush administration's weapons of mass destruction, in that neither existed. Both were used to foment war. And if you haven't seen it, Wag the Dog. It's a pretty good and mostly relevant movie here. So really, there were no weapons of mass destruction, whatever those are. There was no Spanish infernal machine. Probably, in fact, a drunken sailor dropped his pipe in the gunpowder cask. But and Hearst didn't start the war, and neither did his rivalry with Pulitzer, and that rivalry is pictured bottom right, where they are themselves caricatured in the sort of yellow outfit that gave its name to yellow journalism, as kind of fighting, childlike, like toddlers, over who owns the war, who started it, who gets it, right? But it wasn't their rivalry that started the war. Pulitzer was right about the power and therefore the responsibility of the press. I think he was right about that. But Americans at the time were ready for war. The frontier was closed. There was a huge influx of immigrants, but the nation was, we were exerting some kind of control over that, whether through optimism or through anxiety and laws curtailing it. Americans wanted to keep going. They wanted to keep expanding. They wanted to rule the world, and they wanted to feel good about it, right? And you just have to stop and ask yourself, does anything strike you as familiar in that? And this is just a set of images that kind of reflects the American sentiment. Remember the Maine, right? And that's to the right of Uncle Sam, to the left of the screen. And don't forget the starving Cubans, right? Like, what are we fighting for? Don't worry about it, as long as we're fighting. And remember the Maine really became a rallying cry, a battle cry for America to, again, feel sort of empowered in its own capacity to do good and kind of kick ass doing it, they had Theodore Roosevelt in government as assistant secretary to the Navy at the time. We know he wanted war. But as undersecretary, he had no real authority to enter the fray or to order others to do so, not without orders. But it doesn't stop him. With, again, no authority, but clearly plenty of power. And seeing that war is imminent, when the Maine explodes, he telegraphs the admiral of the fleet in the Pacific and tells him, if war breaks out, take Manila. He telegraphs all the naval commanders and, prepping them for war. Same basic message. Take Guam, take Puerto Rico, take it all, right? Which, of course, they did. What were most specifically valuable as coaling stations at the time. Remember, ships ran on coal, and you needed to stop and refuel every once in a while. They're now Navy bases. Roosevelt orders ammunition, he orders supplies, he gets Congress's approval to recruit an unlimited number of sailors for the war effort before the nation declares war, right? And all of this happens, so the story goes, while the Secretary of the Navy, his boss, Roosevelt's boss, was out for a long lunch, right? I mean, I don't know about that. It doesn't seem likely, but it did happen quickly, and it happened well before America declared war. And again, his quick, gruff, action-oriented leadership, that's part of the myth. That is part of the myth of Roosevelt. So he was an expansionist, especially interested in naval expansion. And this was a time of international expansionism, of aspirations to empire from around the globe. Having already been well prepped for it by Roosevelt and with a public well won over by Hearst and Pulitzer, the U.S. declares war on Spain on April 21st, 1898. Roosevelt immediately resigns his post as the Naval Assistant Secretary and, in order to form the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, also known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a diverse bunch. We're going to linger on them for just a minute here. They were recruited mostly from the Southwest because the heat there was understood to be comparable to the heat that they would face in Cuba, and so they were assumed to be more acclimated to that. The regiment filled quickly. College kids, former classmates of Roosevelt, ranchers, gamblers, roustabouts, and Native Americans. They shipped to Cuba, but their horses never arrived, so although they were recruited as cavalry, they ended up in the field and performing as infantry. Only the commander got a horse. Still, they went down as the Rough Riders, a name taken from and already popularized by the Wild West shows that had been, other than the sort of revivalistic church meetings of the frontier era, this had been the only entertainment that people got. The only entertainment that was really readily available to those yearly multiplying millions as they made their way westward. Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World show. The Congress of Rough Riders was added in 1892 in Europe, actually. These shows traveled by train and by boat, right? But this poster is from 1895, at any rate, well before the Spanish-American War, and Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. These shows dramatized the frontier. They made a show out of westward expansion and the, quote, triumph of civilization. They gave audiences a neatly packaged and entertaining version of Manifest Destiny, which they could understand, applaud, and walk away from. Battles were reenacted, but within a frame and in the interest of dramatic coherence. Battle scenes offered really a backdrop for sharpshooters, which were the stars of the show, and some of which were women. Annie Oakley got her name there, as did Lillian Smith. Much as in the Columbian Exposition's Midway, if you remember that, Native folks were present primarily as exotic others on display for the entertainment and edification of white people, and as the necessary enemy in battle reenactments. But because these were traveling shows, their participation, the participation of Native Americans, was different than it was at the fair, where they were sort of on display and then it was done, right? In a few ways, different in a few ways. In Buffalo Bill's and the other big shows, Indian performers were paid the same as other performers. They were treated the same. They ate the same food. They lived in the same quarters, right? As the rest of the traveling troupe. Performers traveled with their families, who often worked as extras in native Indian villages, Indian village scenes that were also on display. Other performers' families also worked as extras in other scenes, right? And the scenes were meant to be authentic. Like, that's what Buffalo Bill and the other leaders were going for of these shows. So they were encouraged to retain their language. Native Americans were encouraged in this context to retain their language, their customs, their rituals, and to teach them to their kids. So they were part of this famous, well-paid traveling show, and a lot of benefits came with that. Money, for one, more than was generally available on the reservations at the time, on the reservations that were still being established at the time. Encouragement to keep their culture, albeit for entertainment purposes, ultimately, encouragement to keep their culture, which was, in most of the rest of the states, being really violently suppressed. Access to the powerful people through which their causes were sometimes carried. Not a bad life, especially relatively. except for the structural context. These shows thrived in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, were really just gone, disappeared within the first decade and a half of the 20th century. Other entertainment sources came up. There was a world war that distracted people, and there was also an increasing distance from this frontier, from the frontier moment. The frontier was closing. This was the heyday of the symbol of the frontier, right? And that symbol was most concretely encapsulated in a rugged, strong, wily white man, making his way west, advancing the cause of civilization, the hero living into the American dream of manifest destiny. Everybody wanted to be him. The kids had pop guns. The crowds cheered, right? This was the vibe of these Wild West shows. Genocide didn't play well, so it wasn't included. It was elided or removed from the narrative. The Indians in Buffalo Bill's shows had a pretty good life in terms of food and shelter, even in terms of human community interaction, small-scale cultural retention, with their families, with the other players. But every day in every show, they played out the destruction of their culture. They pantomimed perpetually a losing battle in a family-friendly way, devoid of the brutality and inhumanity, but nonetheless losing. Celebratory, though, really, because it was all framed within the triumph of civilization, which was a huge theme for late 19th century, early 20th century Americans. And that's where Roosevelt's Rough Riders got their name. It's not accidental. Roosevelt participated in the same complex expansionist world, in the same context of what counted as heroism and even as enlightened practice. So the Rough Riders went back to Cuba. They fought in a few battles, and they came back. Having fought alongside Native Americans, Roosevelt's more egregiously racist notions of this new American race changed. His more egregiously racist notions of savagery changed. But the melting pot was as close as he came to what looks like any kind of modern-day pluralism. Cultural assimilation was to be the economic and social salvation of not just Native Americans, but of everyone, right? This is a quote that pretty well represents it. Any man who says he is an American, but something else also, isn't an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is loyalty to the American people. In the context of Native Americans, this meant detribalization, absolute and total detribalization. And he was, what he was right about is that the individualistic industrial culture of America didn't accommodate tribal experience or modes of being. What we have not yet reckoned sufficiently with is that it still doesn't. So the Spanish-American War lasted 10 weeks. It destroyed the Spanish Empire and really solidified the American Empire. Having been on the front pages everywhere, this war changed the way Americans thought about themselves. America was a world power, bringing peace. Spain was destroying Cuba, and America was helping. It had to help, right? Out of virtue, out of morality, out of, justice. This idealistic militarism, this missionary zeal, was already there, already had a hold on the hearts of Americans, on American consciousness. Pulitzer and Hearst and others, they just played into it. The war came, the war went. America not only seized Manila, Guam, and Puerto Rico, it also got a base in perpetuity on Guantanamo Bay. So that's where Gitmo came on the scene. Take a second to think about that. And Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, returned, became vice president, and then in 1901 president, and in 1902 the same expansionist enthusiasm rises in him once more, this time with its sights set on Panama. He's not sure at first where he wants the canal, but he knows he wants one, and since the French had already started digging through Panama way back in 1882, de Lesseps, the guy who built the Suez, started this project, but having really disregarded all of the advice of Panamanians about the weather and whatnot, 20,000 men died, a fortune was spent, Du Lesseps, gave up. But because he'd already started, Roosevelt thought, well, that's a good spot, right? I want it. And in 1902, he starts negotiating with Colombia, which nationally controlled Panama. Roosevelt offered Colombia money. Colombia said no. So Roosevelt parked the U.S. Navy fleet off the coast of Panama and fomented civil unrest, like a civil uprising, a rebellion. And that led to the new Panamanian government and a contract for the Panama Canal. This whole series of events, along with the Venezuelan crisis, also of 1902, where Germans, British, and Italians blockaded Venezuelan ports in the effort to collect a debt, these things together led to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, remember, from 1823, asserted American hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, declared the Americas closed to European colonialism. The Roosevelt corollary maintains American power and extends it. It reads, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, read America, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. With Theodore Roosevelt, America's imperialism is assured. It's rugged, it's capable, it's strong. Roosevelt's own "speak softly and carry a big stick" became something of a motto for this imperialism, and that's what's pictured on the bottom right with the caption, "The World's Constable." He modeled that so-called new American character born of frontier struggle, though again he was born in New York, a character that's rugged, democratic, self-determined, and he models for us now also the structural violence and racism built into that system. Now, he believed in the white man's burden. I've assigned the Kipling poem of the same name. It's hard to see the Roosevelt corollary apart from this, apart from the notion of the white man's burden, apart from that now clearly disavowed notion, but the Roosevelt corollary we maintain. Read Kipling's poem, and it's not satire. It was sincere at the time, and it wasn't. It was held by many people, and those people were progressive. That's who it was held by. At the turn of the 20th century, those who adhered to the notion of the white man's burden were genuinely considered progressive. We can see it now as clearly arrogant, condescending, dehumanizing, racist, wrong. Pile on the adjectives. But then, in Roosevelt's time, in the time of the Spanish-American War and the Roosevelt corollary, at the time of the closing of the frontier, it was understood as generous, liberal, humanitarian, responsible. And it was fixed firmly in the American mythos, and it's not gone from there. We no longer refer to America's remedial role in the affairs of other nations in racial terms. It's no longer the white man's burden, but the moral responsibility to support and perpetuate the civilizational goals of the so-called First World, to maintain global peace through war. That remains deeply embedded in the living myths of America today. It would be short-sighted of us not to think that future historians will see something arrogant or condescending in that. This 1905 political cartoon seems not, the caption, its title is Peace, seems not irrelevant to us today. Roosevelt was an imperialist. He made the U.S. a global power. He came up in the era of print media expansion, and while he had some verbal and legal battles with the press, he took an ill-advised and unsuccessful suit against Pulitzer's New York World for what he called misstatements of fact. He was also the first president to invite the press into the White House. They used to hang out outside the building. He created the press briefing, the White House press briefing, and the room they were allowed to hang out in. He was rugged, an authentically determined, diligent representative of the frontier ideal. He isn't some, he, the man, wasn't some ideal sort of godlike and stable figure in 60 feet of granite on Mount Rushmore any more than Lincoln was in 19 feet of marble. He's not unchanging. He's absolutely not perfect. He's a person deeply flawed. Some would say unforgivable. Others would say, I would say it's not our job to forgive history. It distracts our energy from what we should be doing. What we should be doing is learning from it. And a great deal of Roosevelt's frontier ideal, his will to power, still defines us as a nation, often unthinkingly. A great many of his calls to reform still inspire us. You know, how much would you like to see corporate lobbyists out of campaigns, out of Congress? You know, he ran in 1912 as a progressive, a third-party ticket, and at that he didn't win, but he did get more votes than any third-party candidate has ever gotten in an American presidential election. During that campaign, he was shot in the chest, and this is where, you know, it's not as though the attribution of this frontiersman mythic image to him is without cause or precedent. During the 1912 presidential campaign, which again he lost, he was giving a speech and he was shot in the chest. The bullet was slowed by the copy of the speech that he had in his pocket, but it still lodged itself right next to his heart. He continued speaking. He finished the speech. For 90 minutes he continued speaking, finished the speech. So again, the bullet stayed in his chest for the rest of his life. It was too close to his heart to, you know, realistically remove. But you've probably heard that one. It's part of the grand mythos that accrues to this guy who was, you know, who also oversaw a legislation, you know, the 1902 act to order Native American men to cut their hair, you know, because that was going to help with the assimilationist model of social uplift that was the closest that this era came to what we might consider an acceptance of diversity or pluralism. So in the Spanish-American War era, tabloids masquerading as news began to really shape Americans' political attitudes towards war through spectacle. Shameless, lurid clickbait. And that war, for the public as for the president, was something like a romanticized, rugged offshoot of the romanticized, rugged frontier. Just an expansion of that frontier notion to an international imperial frame. Next, we turn to World War I, where there is not so much in the way of romanticizing